Hello, everyone, and thanks for being with us for our Insulin 100 panel on behalf of MaRS Impact Health. It's my great pleasure to be your moderator today for this panel. I'm Ivan Semenek, science reporter for the Globe and Mail. In the process of moderating the panel, I hope to be learning along with you as we explore the future of diabetes and related research areas here in Canada. I'm sure most of the audience is aware of the anniversary that provides the impetus for this panel. It was 100 years ago this spring that Frederick Banting and Charles Best first began the work that would lead to the discovery of insulin as a treatment for diabetes. And as it happens, most of the events surrounding that incredible breakthrough took place just a short stroll from the location of the MaRS building today. So it's 100 years of time, but maybe only 100 meters of distance that separates us from that turning point in Canadian science. Now, if you don't know the story well, I strongly recommend The Discovery of Insulin by the late Michael Bliss. It's a book that everyone involved in biomedical research and health innovation in Canada should read. It's an incredible story. But just briefly to recap, I think what's so striking about the insulin story when we look back 100 years is that when you review the key events of that time, it's just stunning to see how rapidly things unfolded. It's as though the time frame for the discovery of insulin really had more in common with what we're seeing now with the development of the COVID-19 vaccines, for example, more like that than sort of the more typical long hard road from kind of idea to drug discovery to patient therapy. That's more typical. So just to give you a sense of that, it was, Banting and Best began their first experiments on or about May 17th, 1921. That was just after Banting arrived in Toronto from London, where he'd been teaching a course and where he sort of closed down his medical practice. Charles Best had just finished writing his last exam as a fourth-year medical student at U of T. They set about cleaning up an old lab that they'd been given to work in by John J.R. McLeod, head of physiology at U of T. That's where they began their work with dogs and testing an idea that Banting had just the previous fall about the pancreas. And by August, through that summer, they were starting to see positive results from their experiment. By the end of the year, by the end of 1921, they were well along the way, with the help of James Collip, a biochemist, towards developing and refining the techniques for extracting and purifying insulin. Insulin was first given to a human subject in January of 1922 at Toronto General Hospital. By the summer of 1922, production facilities were being set up by Connaught Labs in an old YMCA building on campus. And by November of 1922, you had basically mass production of insulin just 18 months after Charles Best and Frederick Banting had begun their experiments. And of course, a year later after that, Banting and McLeod shared Canada's first Nobel Prize for the discovery of insulin. So just an amazing story, not too bad for, sort of 18 months worth of work. In a sense, our panel today, in an unofficial way, is to kind of ask the question, okay, so after 100 years, isn't it about time that we got around to doing something like that again in Toronto? And if so, how can we get there? So joining me to talk about this today is a wonderfully qualified panel whose introduction I will keep short so that we have more time to talk, but you can find out more about them on our website as well for this event. So first we have joining us Dr. Daniel Drucker. He is a clinician scientist at the Lunenfeld Tannenbaum Research Institute at Mount Sinai Hospital and one of this year's winners of the Canada Gardner International Award for his work on metabolic hormones. Now that work has also led to treatments and it has a direct connection also to the insulin story. Next, we have Michael Midmer. He's the CEO of Zucara Therapeutics, which is also working in the space of metabolic disease here in Toronto. And finally, we have Connie Chen, Senior Director of Strategy and Corporate Development for Facet. That's the commercial venture group that is looking to smooth the translation and commercialization of research here in Ontario. So she'll have a perspective on that as well. Thanks all three of you for joining us. And so I think maybe we should start just sort of completing that bridge from Banting and Best 100 years ago to where we are now in Toronto. Obviously, lots has happened in the diabetes department since then, but in some ways, there's still a lot to be done. Insulin, as we know, is not a cure for diabetes, and the work is proceeding to try to understand how we can improve the situation for people who have diabetes. And of course, it is also a condition that is increasing in some ways with as the demographics changes and because of lifestyle and other changes that are occurring, in the developed world. So maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Drucker. How would you bring us up to date? Where are we at now? 100 years after the discovery of insulin, and what are the key questions for diabetes and related diseases?
So let's divide up diabetes as we do clinically into type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I think for type 2 diabetes, the kind that generally occurs later in life, that's not the complete destruction of the beta cells, we've witnessed over the last 10 years unbelievable innovation, and this innovation continues. So we now have very powerful drugs that can reduce the complications of type 2 diabetes, that can prevent kidney disease and heart disease, and pretty soon really almost normalize blood sugar to the point where people are saying, have we put the disease in remission? So the unmet needs for type 2 diabetes are probably shrinking at a more rapid pace, but the greater opportunities where there is tremendous progress is in the area of type 1 diabetes. And these opportunities range from stem cell therapies to preventing the disease itself with immune interventions, to refined artificial pancreas devices that really do all the work for you, as well as reducing or preventing the complications, as one of our co-panelists will describe as well. So lots of exciting science, and we're going to have tremendous progress in type 1, particularly over the next decade.
Got it. And Michael, I'd like to ask you that question too from your perspective. I know you're kind of working on trying to get therapies to market. How does it look from your perspective, and what's the cutting edge?
Yeah, so I think, as Dr. Drucker has mentioned, a lot is focused on the cure, looking at beta cells and how you can restore or reduce the destruction of those beta cells over time. We focused on the alpha cell, and the alpha cell releases glucagon, which is kind of the opposite mode of action of insulin, to bring that sugar back up when you go low. And what we still find with people taking insulins as they've gotten better and better over the years is that they suffer from this low blood sugar occurrences, which can be very dangerous and disruptive to their lives, which is called hypoglycemia. And so we're developing the first drug of its kind to prevent hypoglycemia from occurring. And we've benefited a lot from research that's come out of the University of Toronto. Some of our founders was actually the last postdoc in Charles Best's lab, Dr. Mladen Vrenik, who I believe Dr. Drucker knows quite well. And he went on to do research with Dr. Michael Riddell, who we continue to work with, and that led to the formation of Zucara. And now we've completed phase 1 clinical trials, and we've just started the next trial to look at the proof of concept of our therapeutics. So, I think there are a lot of different ways to tackle diabetes now, and it continues to get better. That cure is certainly something that is on a lot of people's minds, but there are other technologies that are around there that make it easier to manage for the people that have the disease.
That's interesting. And of course, while all this is going on, it's been an interesting road for insulin in terms of, as a profit center for companies that make it. And this is obviously not something perhaps that Banting had in mind, or the discoverers of insulin when they sold the patent rights to U of T for $1. Obviously, it didn't quite work out that way. And just in recent years, especially in the U.S., where it's a different system, but we've seen the cost of insulin for example, in some cases tripling. And that's been a growing concern for something that has been discovered and known for 100 years. Connie, I want to ask you about that too, just about, you know, that balance between the cost of innovation, which is really what we're talking about here with the cutting edge, and how to, you know, how to make that realistic and realizable as treatments for patients.
It's a really good point, actually, because it's you know, it's not that like you said, the discussion about pricing is a really, really complex one. There's been a lot of suggestions of what you could do to bring it down, but rather than specifically talking about the price itself, we tend to focus on, well, what can you do so that there's more of a voice, and there's more competition, and there's a stronger voice for Canada or groups to be able to say, well, let's commercialize it better. Let's take that research and create that continuous momentum for innovations to actually get to the market, get to patients, and drive competition, so that you will have more of that natural pressure on prices, so that you can't just, that there are alternatives for patients. And so for us, it's not so much about the pricing as what can governments, actually both private and public sector, how can we work together and provide the right environment so that that ecosystem can actually be stronger. You need that risk capital, you need that expertise, you need people willing to do this over and over again. And when you get success, you'll have that momentum continue, and so that you can have the scenarios. Because if you think about where, you know, if Dr. Banting and Best and McLeod and Collip had thought, well, we might actually be able to have more patients exposed to innovative medicines and experimental medicines if there was more being done locally. Because eventually, even though they wanted to try to keep the price down for patients, it still went to the US. The value went to the US, the jobs, the economy, the new innovations went elsewhere instead of being kept locally. What if they had negotiated so that they could have more rights, they could have more value generated here? And that feeling that they had, that excitement of working day in and day out to develop that purified form of insulin, what if they passed it to their next graduate students to do the same thing and had the capital, the support of the government, like they initially did through Connaught laboratories and whatnot, to produce in Canada? What if that was here? Like we're experiencing that now with the vaccines, the COVID vaccines. It's a bit of a interesting story how that, like you talk about arc, that's a interesting arc to follow, the 50 years of where the, you know, vaccine production has gone. And if we had created that ecosystem where you continuously generate that, you know, you might see that difference. And we have actually, at Facet, we've invested 40 million, brought in about $1 billion back into the Ontario system. That's about a 30 times leverage. And with that, we've actually also asked that we only partner with those who are interested in benefiting the local ecosystem, developing here, producing here, having clinical trials here, so that patients don't have to wait for the approval of medicines, but they can actually get access to experimental medicines sooner. And that kind of whole cycle and the momentum is really what we're talking about. So we think not so much as let's directly pressure to lower the price right now. It's what can we do so that Canada has a seat at the table to say, how can we benefit patients more? You need to pay to play in a bit.
Got it. Now, I'd actually like to kind of go through that in a little bit more depth with each of the three of you, you know, talking about that ecosystem as Connie describes it. You know, we've sort of from the research perspective, from the clinical perspective, and kind of getting prospective therapies to patients, and then finally kind of capitalization and commercialization, and trying to build that infrastructure here. I'd love to ask each of you, you know, we know that there's a need for support. There's a need, in a sense, for some kind of critical mass to kind of help things along. You know, with Banting and Best, there was a certain amount of kind of right people at the right place at the right time to really get something over the finish line. And it was a time where insulin was sort of in the air. I mean, no one knew what it was, but other groups have been working, other people have been looking at this question elsewhere in the world. It was the U of T team that finally got there. Of course, now everything moves a lot faster. Competition is intense. I'm sure Dr. Drucker knows all about that from the research perspective. So if I start with you, Dr. Drucker, if I were to ask the question, kind of what do we need in terms of the human capital, in terms of the expertise? I mean, maybe it's the stem cell work, or maybe it's the way that researchers are linked up. If there's something that you would say, this is what we need to kind of get to the next step in terms of people or expertise or the way they're deployed, how would you, from the research perspective, what do we need?
I think from the human capital, we can divide this into the scientists, and there I think Canadian scientists are really second to none. We're not lacking talent across many aspects of science in Canada. One can argue that our talent at the human capital level, maybe for formation of companies, for raising venture capital funds, for that whole ecosystem. We're getting better, much better over the last 25 years, but maybe we're deficient there. I think what we're really lacking actually is just investment. In a sense, our Canadian pharmaceutical and scientific enterprise is a little bit like our defense industry. We take it for granted. We're very proud of our healthcare system. We're very proud of our Canadian armed forces. But if you actually look at the data, we underinvest in science and healthcare compared to the G7. We underinvest in our defense and our armed forces compared to the United States and the G7. And we really depend on the United States to do the heavy lifting in terms of the expenditures and the development, which then the rest of the world benefits from. And what many of us don't realize, I think everyone on this panel does, is that the vast majority of the profits that enable the existence of the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry are made in the United States on the back of those exorbitant drug prices. And so wouldn't it be better to have a greater investment in many countries like Canada and a greater degree of expenditure and having a bit more of a level playing field to support innovation ecosystems in many different countries and not just rely on the United States?
So that's interesting. And I want to talk also to Michael and Connie about that investment side of things. But I want to turn back again to the lab, Dr. Drucker. Let's just imagine that some of that investment could come through, or that someone in Ottawa is persuaded by this panel, and there's a ramp up. Where, in terms of strategic, like from a research perspective, strategically kind of placing the bets, and if there was more investment for the science, where would you put it? What kind of expertise, or what kind of area? Would it be stem cells? Would it be gene editing? Would it be, kind of what combination of?
Yeah, so here's where I think most scientists would probably disagree with the concept of strategic investment. It is impossible for scientists or government bureaucrats or the head of granting agencies to predict the area of scientific investment that will lead to the next great breakthrough. Let's just go to COVID-19 and the RNA vaccines that are saving our lives, that came out of very basic science, biotechnology, RNA biology. No strategic power would have predicted 10 years from now that investment in that very basic science technology would basically save the free world. And so we are underfunded across a range of science, from physics to chemistry to ecology to bioengineering to basic science and life sciences, etc. I think we should not pretend that we continue this ability to have a crystal ball and be strategic about our investments. It's just not possible. We have to support a strong scientific enterprise, because no one knows where the next important breakthrough is going to happen that will enable our society to grow healthier and sustain the quality of living. So I think most scientists feel pretty strongly when we hear the word strategic, we get a bit of an anaphylactic reaction.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to have provoked that, and if it weren't for COVID, I think the other example we might be going to would be CRISPR, and it's probably worth
100%.
Reminding, that's something that came out of trying to figure out how to stop yogurt from going bad.
Yeah, or PCR studying the temperature dependent ability of enzymes and bacteria. So the whole concept of strategic, I think, is self-serving for politicians. I understand why they like it. It's glamorous, it's shiny. It doesn't work to safeguard the health and prosperity of a nation.
Right. Now, the other thing that's interesting about some of these more recent innovations is that they do often involve kind of an interplay between university-based and company-based research, and there's sort of a cascade of like a positive feedback that can happen in some cases. So Michael, now I want to turn to you with that same idea about, we need more investment, but, how would you move the whole system forward if you wanted to build a stronger innovation system here?
Well, when I think about building Zucara, I think we started with a great idea. And like Dr. Drucker says, there's tons of great research and ideas in Canada. And you can get some seed funding to start proving that out. But the big funding that you require is to move those through clinical trials or proof of concept testing. And that was the struggle for us, is finding that $5 million to get to phase 1. And we were lucky enough to have found that with JDRF and the Helmsley Charitable Trust, which are organizations that are there to support new diabetes technologies. However, if they weren't there, we would have struggled and we would have waited longer and longer to get into the clinic. And then once we got to the phase 1 starting point, we attracted the interest of major venture capital and a top tier fund out of the US. And so it's that chain is broken in Canada. We can get that seed funding to start those ideas, but then to really translate them and commercialize those into realities and then eventually into products doesn't happen quickly. And so it's amazing watching COVID mature so quickly into vaccines that who would have thought within less than a year someone would be getting a vaccine from a technology that has been in development, but that sense of urgency allowed it to be commercialized into a product. And if there was more funding, from my view, directly into companies, not so much into the academic space, which is absolutely critical, but in the US, they have a program called SBIR, where they take money from the major departments in the government, and a portion of that funding goes into company creation and commercialization. And that's where we're missing to really turn those into eventually products that could be manufactured here in Canada.
Got it. And a follow-up to that, I find myself wondering, I think, as you say, everyone is just sort of in awe of what has happened with the COVID-19 vaccines, the RNA vaccine in particular, but just but that's not the only, other platforms have also been advanced. Even the news today from Novavax about how well a protein subunit vaccine seems to be working, and that's just 6 months later from the rollout of the RNA vaccine. So there's a lot of very fast and very positive movement. I'm wondering is this changing biomedical science forever, or what are the lessons, the fact that this rapid response occurred?
The lesson is money talks. So when you have an influx of money going towards, and the government is working and with the private sector to do it, you can get a lot. Both Dr. Drucker and Michael have said so many very true things. It's, if we could have, any one of us could strategically pinpoint what research to go into, we'd not be sitting here. We'd be resting in the Cayman Islands somewhere. And even with the seed capital portion, that's really what we do. And I think it's the definition of seed capital. So for life sciences, what people tend to forget is to develop a technology or drug that actually gets it to the market is still a really, really, really big investment. It does typically take a long time, unless you're able to throw hundreds of millions, if not billions, towards it to get it to work faster, and that sharing of the science and whatnot. And so if you take a look at some of the other industries in Canada, like IT, they'll tell you that they have a lot of seed capital and not enough growth capital for the scale up, that SME portion. When we're talking life sciences, it really is still the seed where, that straddles the catalyst, that sort of valley of death. It's too late for the typical basic research, but it's way too early for a lot of even the venture capital. So as Dr. Drucker was mentioning before, you need that risk capital to come in. because it takes so long for life sciences to get to fruition most times, it's not very economical for people to come in really, really early, as Michael was saying, in that part to create the company and to fund it in that early seed/Series A portion to get it to the point where it can have an inflection point in value and risk mitigation. That might be the clinical trials. Sometimes it could be earlier. And there's a big gap in Canada for that. And that's where we're lacking that infrastructure. And you almost need some level of strategic, I'm going to go back to the word that the academics hate. The strategic investment is more about the investment into the infrastructure of supporting innovations, the commercialization, the translation, to get it to the point where you will find the syndicate of investors willing to take it up and move it to the next level. And imagine if Canada actually had the receptors within Canada to drive it forward, so we wouldn't have to leave Canada and go to the US to create the value there. And I think that's our challenge, is you can't fault institutions of letting innovations go to the US when there aren't receptors or players who are willing to invest in that IP early on when they're all located in the US. Like, what if you could build that here?
Got it. You know, that's, and you anticipated my next question actually, which is
Sorry.
how do we keep that? No, but that's good. Like, how do we keep that IP in Canada? Because, you know, this is what we worry about with artificial intelligence. This is what we've worried about in the past with other places where Canada has seemed to be ahead of the curve on the research end. And then we sort of see the gradual dissipation of that IP, you know, kind of migrating outward. And, you know, is there a way to stop that pattern?
Well, if you let me go on my soapbox again, I'd say yes. You know, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find that ground because it's so early. You almost need to incentivize investors and participants to come in and build with you. And that requires a joint public-private sector type partnership and policies that incentivize the investors to come in and play. And if you have more voice, and if you're able to invest yourself, like what we do, a lot of the money that we invest actually doesn't come from the government, it's from our returns. We've been actually lucky enough to generate returns from our investments, and we reinvest into Ontario. And we make sure that it's an Ontario first type capital where we consider what will benefit both the patients and the economy, and say, no, we would like to have this here for as long as we can. Let's have more clinical trials or manufacturing done. And if you build that 10 times over, 5 times over, you start getting that momentum where we are seeing Ottawa scientists who've done it once, wanting to come back and do it again here because they have done it.
Got it.
And I can see Michael wants to jump in, so I'm.
I know exactly. Michael, do you want to? We've just got a minute left. Do you want to say one quick thing, Michael?
I would just say we're starting to see that happen. Like $250 million for manufacturing of COVID here locally, $250 million for a clinical trials program to fund, hopefully, research beyond COVID. So I think the government has woken up. COVID has sparked that interest in investing in healthcare, and hopefully that's a very good thing that's come from all of this, to try and move those new innovations forward and keep them here in Canada.
Got it. I have one more question for each of you, very, very quickly, just like one sentence response, because I feel like we've just started this conversation. Hopefully it's given our audience something to think about. If you could go back 100 years, step in a time machine and run into Frederick Banting walking down College Street, what would you tell him, Dr. Drucker?
I would say that if you get a good night's sleep and you have a dream and you work hard to actualize that dream, you can accomplish greatness as he did. It's almost an unbelievable story, as you highlighted, Ivan, at the top. And we need more Frederick Bantings that have dreams, that work hard to fulfill their dreams, that close down their previous ventures, throw everything away that they've been working on, and pursue that 1 in a million possibility. Canada needs to take more risk, is my final comment.
Excellent. Michael, how about you? Words for Dr. Banting?
Well, you talked about selling the patent for $1. What if he didn't? How would that change the culture of entrepreneurship in Canada? if that wasn't. It was an absolutely noble cause that he did that, but would it have changed our thinking and all the scientists ahead of him in terms of how they think about entrepreneurship?
Got it. Excellent. And last word to you, Connie.
Oh, I was going to say the exact same thing. I would just say, don't sell for $1. It's not bad. You can still do something noble. You can encourage your next generation of grad students and the next entrepreneurs to build and do the same thing. You can take your profits and support that, right? So I was like, darn it, Michael. Took the words out of my mouth.
I think we've proven that time travel doesn't exist, because if it had, then Fred Bansing would have been assaulted by dozens of people saying, don't sell the patent. But anyway, hopefully we can apply these lessons going forward and you know, kind of think about what it means for us going forward. And also how to encourage that stronger science ecosystem in Canada. It's been wonderful hearing from all of you. It's been a terrific panel, all too short, but hopefully the conversation can continue. I'm sure it's got lots of people energized. Thank you again, Dr. Drucker. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Connie Chen, for all of your input, and good luck with all of your future endeavors. Thank you, audience, for joining us. Stay tuned for our next session, a fireside chat with Dr. Vin Gupta, Chief Medical Officer for Amazon's COVID-19 response. Thanks.